Goodfellas by Martin Scorsese is a cinematic classic, and probably my favorite film of the gangster genre. The story of Henry Hill and his comrades, which is the basis of the movie, has been told many times, but it still has relevance. That's why we decided to make a video about Hill. However, we wouldn't be us, and they wouldn't be them, if we didn't try to push the boundaries of this story, going a little further than most other authors in the internet world. In addition to detailing the part of the story that formed the basis of the film, we'll also detail how Henry lived after he went into the witness protection program. And believe me, there's a lot to tell, because Hill was a wise guy, and remained one all his life. Meet Henry Hill on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it, so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance, and enjoy your viewing. Henry Hill was born in 1943 in Brooklyn, a borough in the beautiful city of New York, which at the time could be called beautiful and cursed. This applies equally to the whole city and the borough, which was one of the most densely populated, partially thanks to the immigrants whose family our protagonist came from. The Irish-Sicilian origins of little Henry Hill are very important, because his fate would be linked to the structure of crime, tied also to his purity of origin. Brooklyn is an amazing neighborhood, and was populated at the time by Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrants. The division of this neighborhood between competing factions in the 1900s and 1920s would be encountered during our subject's early life. Henry Hill was born at a very specific time. The devastation of the Great Depression had already been overcome, but the people at that time who, in the midst of unrelenting lawlessness, corruption, and some permissiveness, were going through the most important stages of their youth. They were young, remained strong, and believed that time favored them. Little Henry would think of them as wise guys. Wise guys had a lot of things: money, women, nice suits, power, and respect. Henry Hill, on the other hand, had nearly a dozen brothers and sisters and an alcoholic father who was, however, a skilled laborer with a certain social standing. Little Henry's parents did not belong to criminal gangs. Rather, his father, with his keystone tyrannical ways, insisted that little Hill stay away from both the crime syndicates and the local ethnic gangs that were heavily involved in the drug trade. His father wanted Henry to study, but Henry could not study properly, and later it turned out that he was dyslexic and had significant issues with reading and writing, although with no intellectual problems. Naturally, a boy who wrote and read very poorly was considered stupid back then, which did not help him to comprehend other subjects like science. At the same time, Hill had a real example of success in front of his eyes. His house overlooked a parking lot where local gangsters associated with the MAFIA gathered. They would be constantly referred to as wise guys by Henry in his memoirs. Henry Hill, as a young boy, saw the enormous social divide in the community. Poverty and a fairly visible ethnic divide within neighborhoods intersected remarkably well with the showy wealth of the portion of the population that was involved with crime. Henry's father despised criminal entities, but could give nothing in return to a young man beckoned by nice suits, power, and prospects. Unlike his cinematic incarnation, Henry did not aspire to become a mafioso. His aspirations were much simpler and more down to earth. He wanted money and to get into the business. Well, and to be with the tough guys. This is because Henry, when he became closely and warmly acquainted with the local criminal elements, was very young, barely 12 years old. In the following years, he would drop out of school and concentrate entirely on working with the mob. His parents learned about it early enough, although not immediately, but they could do nothing. Little Henry was lucky in a way. He managed to get acquainted not with just any gangsters, but with the real-life mobsters. The Vario brothers, Lenny, Teddy, and Polly. They were members of the Lucchese family, one of the 5 families of mafia clans that control New York City. Paul Vario was already a capo, a man who held a very high place in the mafia hierarchy. All the Vario brothers liked the little knucklehead named Henry Hill, so he was soon enough given a job. Henry began washing their cars, cleaning Polly's boat, and parking mafia Cadillacs in lots. What more could a 12-year-old ask for? He wasn't even touched by the local cops because Henry was with the family. After he turned 14, he became a member of the construction union that was in the hands of Lenny Vario. Henry had a job and received a lot of money, of which he kept only scraps, in total a little over $100 a week. The rest was taken by the family, but it was incredibly comfortable conditions. Then Henry dropped out of school and began to deal only with the affairs of the Mafia. Hill even tried to work honestly on the construction site, but it was hard work, so he switched to collecting bets on gambling and successfully coped with it, earning the unequivocal approval of the representatives for the Lucchese family. At the same age, Henry met Jimmy Burke, who he would be associated with for most of his life. Henry served drinks and sandwiches during card games, and Burke gave him money and tips comparable to the daily wages of an ordinary laborer. A little later was their first real crime at the boss's behest. Vario opened a rival taxi stand not far from another establishment. Its owner was not going to listen to the local lord and refused to fold his business. So Henry burned one of his cars in the parking lot at night, breaking the windows, pouring gasoline on it, and throwing burning matchboxes into it. Another year later, at age 16, was his first arrest. Henry was busted when he and Paul Vario's son used a stolen credit card to buy tires for Teddy Vario's wife's car. Only Hill was caught, and he was interrogated quite harshly even for the time. But he gave up nothing but his own name. Vario's lawyer got Henry released on bail. His behavior after his arrest finally convinced Paul Vario that Henry was a wise guy. Because of his background, Henry could not become a member of the Lucchese family. So he later became its associate, falling in with another associate, the very same Jimmy Burke. By now, Henry was 17 years old and had run away to join the U.S. Army. Yes, he ran away from the authorities, who actively took up the fight against organized crime. This struggle had become much more acute in response to the Mafia's activity and a certain redistribution of power. Of course, this redistribution did not directly affect Henry himself. He was a bird flying too low, both at that time and in general within the structure of the American Mafia. However, the overall trends affected everyone involved. You can see more details about the showdown in our videos on Carlo Gambino, Joe Bonanno, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia. In these videos, said redistributions and conflicts are examined in detail and from different angles. In the context of our story, only the meeting in Appalachia in the late 1950s is important, as it's where most of the entire top ranks of the American Mafia were arrested. And although almost no one was sentenced, it served as impetus for recognizing the problem of organized crime in the country. The state decided to take an extremely serious step. A list of 5,000 people connected to organized crime was published. Of course, neither Henry nor his direct patrons were on this list, but the young man decided to hide from the justice machine. Hill himself gives different reasons for fleeing in his different works. In a 1985 book called Wiseguy, which made Henry a celebrity, he explicitly admits that he was simply avoiding trouble with the law. But in his next edition, from 2004, a very different tone emerges. There, Henry begins to talk about the young gangster's Catholic upbringing and the remnants of conscience that led him into the army. Most likely, Mr. Hill in his old age, and to appeal to the growth of his popularity, decided to somewhat smooth out his image as a scumbag mafioso. It is funny enough in the way he conveys his pleasure in army life, and in particular from camping with a fire because he had never seen a fire. His lack of familiarity with fire did not prevent him from burning a car on behalf of a criminal family before his service. In any case, for 3 years Henry became a soldier of the 82nd Airborne Division of the U.S. Army. In his memoirs, this time would be called the most fun he'd ever had. While in the Army, he continued to apply his criminal experience. This was primarily in the area of shooting. Henry boasted that of all of his comrades, only he knew how to shoot a guy before the service, although there is no reliable information that he participated in murders. Henry recalled with equal warmth in the 2004 book his passion for cooking, including his time in the Army. He was an Army cook and commercialized his skills. Simply put, he sold coffee, spices, and oil on the black market to bars, restaurants, and cafes in places where his unit stayed. His criminal activities didn't stop there. Henry sold excise-free cigarettes to the Army, which were supplied to him by his old criminal hookups. He used various fraudulent schemes and usury, and of course he went AWOL. Henry recalled how he came back one time from going AWOL, and his unit was gone, and it had been transferred to another location. His Army career ended the way it should have, in prison. However, Henry went there for stealing a local sheriff's car and fighting with other servicemen, not for his more basic criminal actions. After leaving the Army, Henry went into the business of selling duty-free cigarettes through his patron Jimmy Burke. Jimmy and Henry would work together for many years. Jimmy skillfully assembled a team of bad boys for his boss, Paul Vario. Jimmy was a bad guy himself. He brutally murdered his wife's ex-boyfriend and at one point publicly attacked a veteran journalist. Jimmy didn't particularly like people writing about the Mafia. However, like many other gangsters, he was characterized by heightened sentimentality, gave flowers to the mother of his colleagues, helped children, paid for the treatment of the sick, overall, an outstanding gentleman. But he could kill just as easily, and he liked his associates the same way. For example, Tommy DeSimone, with whom Henry would later rob an airport. By the time Henry Hill was in the tobacco business, he was already a full-fledged Lucchese family guy. He gave a share of his income to Paul Vario, who formerly had nothing to do with the cigarette business. However, the business itself was more than successful. On the first day of work, Henry received $100. In 1964, the average income in the U.S. was $550 a month. And with his teeth cut, he began to hit $4,000 a week. However, cigarettes were only marginal earnings. The real gold mine was at Kennedy Airport. Jimmy racketed the airport's union organizations, and they paid him tribute and leaked important information. If the airport employees did not want to pay, Jimmy sent his team, which included selected psychopaths, who achieved what they wanted by any means. Henry Hill recalled that the mobsters always had a team ready to rob an incoming airplane, waiting only for a message from an informant. Sometimes they could get this information only 15 minutes before loading or unloading and had time to do their dirty deed. The robbers took a variety of goods, notably jewelry, clothing, and cash. If big money was expected to arrive, the mafiosi had all the information at the moment a plane was preparing to take off on the other side of the globe. At the same time, police went to work. Raids were organized, they tried to nail the organizers and intercept the culprits in the process, but there was no use. Everything was quelled and greased with money or intimidation. Henry at this time was a completely ordinary private entity. He had no real status or unique position. He took part in actions to intimidate the right people, marketed goods, set fires, and stole cars and trucks. Hill remembered sacking mail trucks with particular fondness. In the 1960s, huge sums of money, jewelry, stocks, and bonds were sent by mail. Parcels came from individuals, large public companies, and even from states. And in this system, there were informants. The Mafia cell, which Henry belonged to, had enough accurate information about those packages to be intercepted along with the mail vans. The rampant corruption, colossal employee background clearance, and minimal attention to security made the Mafia's work incredibly easy. At the time, there were still no serious systems in place to locate vehicles that were transporting huge sums of money. Meanwhile, the United States was engaged in an incredibly addictive endeavor, saving money on employees. Drivers who transported tens of thousands of dollars were paid minimum wage and were often alone in the car. Henry did not often have to even use force when seizing cars because why would a low-paid driver risk his own life? It was a really lucrative business. So lucrative, in fact, that even within the Mafia, it was not considered shameful to disclose one's real income. For example, Henry and his comrades never hid their real earnings from Jimmy Burke, but they could hide them easily from their boss, Paul Vario. The reason is that he didn't care about the real income of the fighting squads. He needed to get funds in envelopes and solve his own problems. His wife and other women got everything they thought they needed, and the rest Paul and the other mobsters didn't care much about. Henry Hill spent the time from 1964 to 1967 in such an interesting line of work. The only thing that distinguished him from other ordinary performers was his closer association with Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, and the sons of these distinguished gentlemen. In fact, he was Burke's assistant, but he did not yet perform serious organizational functions. This status quo continued until the Air France robbery. The Air France robbery was one of the key events in Henry Hill's life, an event that divided his timeline into before and after. Of course, it's not as famous as the subsequent Lufthansa robbery, but it was after Air France that Henry ceased to be an average worker. It was, of course, also carried out due to a tip-off. The tipster was an Air Force cargo dock foreman named Bobby McMahon. He was Henry's regular informant, though he didn't work for Henry himself, he just passed information through him. At one point, he told about bags of cash that were used in interstate currency exchange. The bags, each containing $60,000, were put simply in a safe with very little security. Its most difficult element was the lock, the keys to which one guard carried with him at all times. The plan for the robbery had been worked out to the last detail, and, on the whole, was quite elegant, though simple and primitive. Bobby had given the group all the security information. They knew for sure that it was not hard to break into the cargo terminal. It didn't need to be done with gunfire and a crew of thugs. The airport cargo terminal was freely open if you wanted to go there. The safe was a bit of a problem. A modern person familiar with crime movies would assume it could simply be blown up, but it was both simpler and more complicated than that. The mobsters decided to make a copy of the key, which, mind you, was never removed from the guard's belt. Which means what? They needed to get the belt off the guard. The same informant found out that the guard was a romantic. The mob hired a classy woman of easy virtue to start a completely unselfish friendship with the guard. And at one point, when the guard and his new girlfriend steamed in the bathhouse of an elite hotel together, Henry, through a locksmith he knew, made a copy of the entire bunch of keys for the safe. The robbery itself was incredibly simple. Henry and Tommy DeSimone simply walked into the terminal at midnight with a huge suitcase openly and without hiding, because it was common for people to go to such areas to look for their suitcases. There they opened the safe with the key, collected the cash inside, simply loaded the bags of money into their suitcase, and walked out. The robbery took place on a Saturday, and they only found out about it on Monday, so, of course, it was impossible to find the robbers. The movie Goodfellas somewhat distorts the story, making it shorter and more entertaining, but the original story is incredible in its simplicity. It wasn't about the genius of the robbers, but the fact that the actual safety standards hadn't been developed yet. The gangsters used all the flaws in the system of their time and got the score almost effortlessly. $480,000 fell into Henry's hands, currently equivalent to about $2 million. The robbers shared with all the bosses because the airport belonged to two criminal clans, the Luccheses and the Gambinos, which took about $100,000. With the rest, Tommy and Henry bought new cars and spent it in Vegas and on other pleasures. The bulk of the money was given to Jimmy Burke in the Commons, which Henry subliminally called the bank. Curiously, in the 2004 book, Henry writes with some sadness that they should have bought a car and hired one lovely lady, who apparently limited herself to just a big tip, but allowed the operation to be completely bloodless. During these same years, Henry found himself with a family in typical mafia fashion. He met his first wife, Karen Friedman, in 1965. They met in an elite mafia restaurant, of which one of the owners was Paul Vario. In this restaurant, Henry not only rested, but also worked. He was actively engaged in usury, for which he was arrested. But Paul easily solved these trivialities, thanks to his connections with senators, prosecutors, and other people in power. His future wife actively visited this bar with her friend, who was attracted to Paul Vario's son. Even though Paulie Jr. was married and Karen's friend didn't really want a relationship with a married man, it didn't bother anyone. Henry accompanied Paul on these double dates, tactically acting as a security guard, and while he was there, he evaluated the attractive girl, got her number, and subsequently, the girl herself. At the time, Henry was 23 years old, had a cool car, and a lot of spare cash. Henry told his wife a story about being a business agent, but everyone knew exactly who he was and where he got his money from. The bar where they met was not frequented by anyone who was unaware of what kind of people met there. The ladies who had recently reached adulthood were especially privy to this. The young couple moved into Karen's house, which Henry had remodeled in no time, using the help of his friends. His wife's family also began to enjoy the benefits of her husband's high income and position, changing the kinds of shopping establishments they visited and, more generally, actively managed their finances. Later, at the dawn of his career, Henry would take great offense to them, as in the long run the wife's family would receive even more than Henry himself, who was never able to save money. Immediately after the wedding, Henry converted to Judaism, even with the support of his Catholic family. Quite unexpectedly, Henry turned out to be a rather zealous Jew, as far as his activities allowed, of course, and this would help him many times. He did not abandon those convictions for the rest of his life. When Henry bound himself to the bonds of marriage, which did not restrict him in any way, he fell into another kind of bondage, this time to prison, for his activities related to the cigarette trade. However, Hill would spend only 30 days there. A year later, he was a successful restaurateur, and it's not hard to become one when you have the joint and committed protection of friends. Henry wanted to have an official business without direct involvement of the Mafia. But this idea did not pan out because this bar quickly became a place where all the local crime elites began to hang out. And all was well until another famous mobster, William "Billy" Bats Benvena, got out of prison. William was a native of Brooklyn. In 1959, he became an associate of the Gambino family, and in 1961, he officially joined it and became a full member of the family. Being a full family member offered a very serious advantage and, most importantly, direct personal protection from the family. Billy managed to get 15 years in prison and got out serving 10 of them. He got in for transporting and dealing heroin. Before he was locked up, he had serious connections and influence in the neighborhood, but Jimmy Burke took it all away. Billy, of course, wanted it all back. The problem for Burke was that he was rich, powerful, and popular, but he wasn't a full member of the mob, and Billy was. A full-fledged member of a mafia family couldn't even be hit. He was protected, and Billy took advantage of that. One day, he publicly and deliberately insulted Henry's friend, Tommy DeSimone. Tommy was an extremely sharp and tough guy, but this time even he had to take the insult, because to do any direct harm to a mafioso was to sign your own death sentence. However, Tommy could not forgive this and plotted Billy's murder. This version of events is widely known. However, Henry Hill told another version, which is much closer to the truth. Tommy's conflict was insignificant, but Bat's claims on Jimmy Burke's territory were very serious, and because of his position, he could very well sell Jimmy out. Jimmy knew it, Billy knew it, and everyone knew it. That was the way the New York Mafia of those years worked. Sometime after his first fight, Billy was once again telling Jimmy that he had to give back all his territories, including the airport and the upscale bar where they would get drunk. Jimmy Burke, as a hospitable host, had his guests drink to the point of insanity. It was at that moment that Tommy DeSimone showed up at the bar and began hitting Billy over the head with a pistol. He beat him down, his body was loaded into a car, and 3 of them, Burke, DeSimone, and Hill, went to dispose of the body. But a mishap occurred. The body refused to die, and Billy was alive, now beginning to bang on the trunk while being transported. When they got to their destination, Jimmy and Tommy finished Billy off, and Henry, according to his own words, stood by and waited. Later, the corpse was hidden, and Henry told several different stories about how and where they hid the corpse. Unfortunately, he's the only source of information on the murder, and since he was also an accomplice to it, the real story will never be told. However, a potentially grave thing had happened. A full member of one of the families had been murdered. Surprisingly, though, there was never any direct reaction from the Gambino family. It wasn't until 9 years after the murder that Thomas DeSimone went missing. It's still not known for sure if he was actually murdered by the Gambino family, but his murder was unofficially confessed by Thomas Argo, the Gambino hitman. Despite the unspoken mafia laws of their time, Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke were not punished. After the Air France robbery and the murder of Billy Bats, Henry Hill became a truly powerful and wealthy gangster. However, modern audiences have a poor idea of what the lifestyle of mafia sidekick was like at the time. In the 1960s and early 70s, they had a lot of money, but that money was gone very quickly. Many gangsters did not know how and did not want to save, gain capital, or legalize it. Henry at that time was a completely typical gangster in this respect. To have a big drinking party, to order himself easy, gorgeous women, to go to Las Vegas or some other cultural spot, this was the usual condition of a gangster who made big money. Henry often didn't have a penny in his pocket, despite having a very high income. When he needed cash, he took it out of the bandit's stash and dumped any of the extra funds into it. Henry, like any self-respecting gangster, had a wife and 2 beautiful children, who he never took care of and had no special connections with. But he had many girlfriends, one of whom, named Linda Rotondi, occupied a special place in Henry Hill's life. Although such women were not few in his life, this one stood out to him. Constant infidelity was quite normal among devout Catholic mobsters. Sometimes wives and mistresses could even be acquainted, because a wife was a specific element of status, as was a mistress. It wasn't so much due to Henry's personality traits as it was what was considered the norm in the society he lived and grew up in. His relationship with Linda set him up with one of the stars of American football, Joe Namath, nicknamed Broadway Joe. If Henry is to be believed, they even became friends. Joe got his nickname because of his love of nightlife and promiscuous behavior. He even owned a bar, but under pressure from the league, was forced to sell. At the same time, Joe was a great athlete, a real star of his time, and he is still alive. though not particularly eager to talk about how he hung out with the Lucchese family. But Henry Hill described this friendship with delight because Joe actively helped him to make money on sports betting. It should be clarified, Henry was far from new to the gambling business, and by the end of the 1960s, he bet both fairly and blatantly cheated, and even engaged in organizing fake matches. Joe's situation was something in between. Joe persuaded Henry to bet on his team in the 1969 championship. The bookies were taking bets on the team at odds of 1 to 6. The bet worked out. Joe Namath was recognized as the best player of the game, and Henry Hill won several $100,000. There were many such winnings, and in 1970, Henry earned more than $400,000 on bets, betting mostly on basketball. Some games were rigged, but most of the bets were completely real, just based on information that never reached the general public. Henry could get any kind of information, where the player had been before the match, who he had slept with, what specific alcohol he drank. He also had highly qualified people who understood the intricacies of the game and predicted the results of matches, possessing a huge amount of insider information. At the same time, Henry Hill occasionally lost very large sums of money. Once he lost more than $100,000 in 1971. However, his friendship with Paul Vario allowed him to ignore such trifles. It was not uncommon for Henry to play on borrowed money in betting shops. If he won, he would pay off his debt, and if he lost, he would simply remind them that he was Vario's man. And that would be the end of the claims from his creditors. Henry was deeply immersed in the gambling industry. However, from time to time, he also acted as a simple soldier who beat debts out of those who refused to pay for their losses in gambling, or beat up bandits who had gone astray. It was also during this time that Henry's introduction to the world of drugs occurred. In '69, his team was able to get almost 70 kilos of methamphetamine for some $10,000 wholesale. The sale would have cost the party almost $500,000, but Henry resold it through a network of accomplices. In addition to the restaurant, he had other proper businesses in order, so as not to be grabbed by the ass by the IRS, like Capone and those other idiot smartasses. Henry produced t-shirts, caps, and other paraphernalia in his garage with his mother-in-law and sister-in-law. His acquaintance with Joe Namath came in handy here. In Henry Hill's garage, there was a machine for silk screening. There, they created clothes with the logo of the team Joe played for. The apparel was sold to the team and elsewhere. The garage was also used to bottle the famous Perrier mineral water, as Henry Hill was able to supply directly to the large networks of clubs without fear of being exposed. After the incredible successes of the 1960s and the turn of the decade, Henry and the Lucchese family began to have problems. The most serious of these was the failure to take over the huge Disney World theme park in Florida. Henry was sent there with 3 fighters in 1972 as a union representative to be the corporation's business agent. Henry even managed to meet Santo Trafficante, the head of the extremely influential Trafficante family from Tampa, who had given him permission to operate. However, a month later, already in New York, all 4 were arrested by the police. Henry received 10 years in prison for extortion, going behind bars in 1974. At that moment, all his friends were in prison. He sat with Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke, and they didn't just share a cell, they had their own floor of the prison. Henry's time in the pen was well spent. He had to start getting an education. At that time, Johnny Dio, a high-status gangster who was living out his life in prison, tried to convince Henry that he needed a real education. He wanted Henry to get involved in manufacturing and selling eyeglasses so that he could have his own clinic and Hill could quietly and legally make several $1 million a year. Considering that the Mafia still held the unions in their hands, there should have been no problems for Henry with personnel, money, or laws. However, such a life did not interest Henry. Even though he was going to school in prison and was going to get a college education, Henry never stopped doing his usual activities. He used drugs and alcohol, occasionally participated in the murders of other prisoners. Many years later, Henry Hill would tell about how Tommy DeSimone killed several people in the prison bakery, and Henry himself was just there and saw it, emphasizing that the crimes will never be solved since the bodies were found in huge vats for mixing dough. Henry Hill also had a conflict with a mobster from the Patriarca family. The guy, who remains unnamed, owed Henry money and was not going to give it back, and once he even hit Henry in response for demanding money. This situation was resolved by Paul Vario, but Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe wanted the blood of the man who had insulted their friend, and judging by Hill's very careful wording, killed him with Henry's participation. After 2 years in prison, Henry got out for a short time, as his father was terminally ill and Hill got the right to visit him. A year later, his father died, and Henry, since he was Jewish, was given another leave of absence for 7 days of mourning, a custom called Shiva. Henry ended up back in prison until 1978. The sentence pushed Henry into a new round of his professional criminal career, as he was waiting for new betting machines and robberies, some of which are called the greatest in history. As strange as it may be, the most famous robbery began with an incredible banality, by MAFIA standards that is, with the fact that one of the airport workers went knee-deep on bets and owed the Mafia a lot of money. The man's name was Louis Werner. Later, he would become the only person convicted of the robbery. The crime was planned by Jimmy Burke. Henry once again acted as his deputy and, at the same time, an ordinary partner. Hill acted as a liaison, receiving information from rank-and-file informants at the airport and relaying it to Jimmy Burke. Even though Burke was not part of a Mafia family, the orders used were absolutely standard for the Mafia. The good guys, like real mafiosi, used all the necessary levels of protection to ensure that the boss was never contacted by low-level rankees. This approach was effective because the only person arrested for the robbery could not turn Jimmy in, though this didn't help Burke much in the end. The plan itself was not complicated and did not contain elegant subtleties, as was the case with the Air France robbery. The gangsters had formed a group of 6 soldiers to be stationed directly at the airport. They were Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Luis Cafora, Joe Manri, Paolo Licastri, and Robert McMahon. Also involved in the operation were Burke's son Frank, who was to drive one of the 2 cars, and Parnell Edwards, who was to get rid of the van. Martin Krugman, one of the bookmakers who worked for Hill and Burke, was the one who got the information about the big money plane from Louis Werner. Louis was also a direct accomplice, and was even supposed to get 10%, but he was a member of the robbery team in a minor way. Henry Hill was in charge of planning and organizing the entire operation under the direction of Jimmy Burke. Each of the participants on average was to receive $20,000, now worth about $100,000, provided that the organizers planned to score $2 million. On December 11, 1978, at 3 a.m., a vanload of robbers pulled up to the cargo terminal, where they cut the locks with bolt cutters and entered the terminal. There they began taking local employees hostage by warehousing them in the dining room. Inside the terminal, the employees offered no resistance and there were no guards. Only one man saw the bandits outside and rushed to escape, shouting for help, for which he was pistol-whipped and also placed with the others. Threatening one of the employees with a gun, they took him to the vault and forced him to open it, and they took out 72 boxes weighing about 1,100 pounds. The boxes were full of cash and other valuables. The whole operation took an hour and 21 minutes. At 4:21, the bandits left, asking not to call the police for the next 9 minutes. At exactly 4:30, the first call to the police was recorded, but there was no point anymore. The gangsters had fled. The riches were divided. Instead of $2 million, the mobsters stole almost 6, $5 million of which was in cash. In today's money, that's about $28 million. All that was left was to cover their tracks and move on with their lives. But it was with these points that their problems began, eventually dealing a serious blow to the Lucchese family. Parnell Edwards, a small-time gangster, was supposed to drive the van used in the robbery to a particular junkyard where the Mafia's associates could easily destroy it. Edwards, however, used the car for his own needs and parked it in the wrong place, in front of a fire hydrant. The police took the car to an impounding lot, and it turned out that the license plates on the car were stolen. Inside were found Edwards' fingerprints, which eventually allowed them to link him to the heist at the airport. So basically, he signed his own death warrant. Tommy DeSimone carried it out. Whether Paul Vario or Jimmy Burke gave it to him is an open question. Police could not tie either Burke or Vario to the crime, but fear gripped the mobsters, so they began to fight it as best they knew how. Following Edwards, Marty Krugman was killed, not living a month after a successful job. Tommy DeSimone was next. The story of Tommy's death is mysterious. He simply disappeared. Officially, his killer was never found, and neither was his body. Everyone from Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke to John Gotti has been suspected. For more on this, see our video on DeSimone himself. Next came a string of murders. Teresa Ferrara, Tommy's girlfriend, was found dismembered in a local body of water. She was outlived by Tom Monteleone and Richard Eaton by a month. They both did not directly participate in the robbery, but the money from it was laundered in an institution that belonged to Tom, and Richard, who was Tom's accomplice, took $250,000 from the laundered funds and ran. And without Tom's help, he would not have been able to do so. Meanwhile, the Lucchese family was actively looking for a snitch in their ranks, which additionally tipped the scales in the death column for both gangsters. Louis Cafora was killed along with his wife, who he had bought a pink Cadillac Fleetwood for and parked it near the airport, despite a direct injunction from Jimmy to keep a low profile. Joe Monry, Burke's longtime comrade and an airport employee who helped plan the crime, was repeatedly offered entry into the witness protection program, but he declined. He was killed in his car, shot in the back of the head. In all likelihood, the shooter was his good buddy, Jimmy Burke. Angelo Sepe, who was linked to many of these murders, was also found dead, but he was probably cleaned out by the Luccheses, who he was a member of. By the end of the summer, only Jimmy Burke's son and Henry Hill were still alive. Henry wanted very much to live. Many people thought he was a fool, but he never was. He realized that he would not survive the sweep and went to cooperate with law enforcement to take down the ones he had walked the same road with for many years. The feds helped him in this decision as well. At one point, the FBI agents dropped by to visit Henry. They began showing him colorful, vivid photos of the dead men who had participated in the Lufthansa robbery. This was accompanied by animated comments like, "Look, this is your friend who you grew up with," and "This is the guy you knew from high school." The main problem was that Henry Hill knew everything he was being told was true. Henry called his lawyer to this meeting, and he helped him get rid of the agents. But the problem was that he reported it to Jimmy and Paul, and Henry really didn't want those two close friends of his to know about any ties between him and any agencies. After all, one of his friends had just recently been killed, possibly for deciding to defect to the authorities. In addition, at this point, Henry Hill was actively dealing drugs and using them himself. Obviously, this did not have a positive effect on his mental state. Henry became afraid not only for himself, but also for his loved ones, for his wife's family, and for his mistress Linda, all of whom were connected, all of whom were on cocaine, and all of whom knew too much about what went on in the mafia circles. The only one he was really afraid of was his immediate boss, Jimmy Burke. Henry was not going to betray the Lucchese family, and generally he really did not to the extent that he could have. The final event that inclined Hill to become an informant, however, was his arrest for drug dealing. Having gone over to the side of the authorities, Henry immediately began to spout information. He told about the sweep of Jimmy's crew, told where exactly the bodies were hidden. He also told about where the money had gone. It had been laundered by Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario's boys. However, Henry's story itself was not very powerful because the law is very tight on this system. While law enforcement officials were being authorized to search Henry's locations, Jimmy Burke learned that Henry had changed sides and that he was about to get a visit to dig up the bodies of his former associates. When they actually came to him, the basement of the bar was already being poured with concrete, and of course, the bodies had been reburied. Burke was originally shut down for parole violations. Henry Hill was a huge help in this. Henry then personally met with Jimmy during the investigation, and even there, under guard with Jimmy behind bars, Henry was incredibly intimidated. That didn't stop him from giving Burke the runaround on every case he could. Henry loved Jimmy. Even when recounting his role in his conviction, Henry praised Jimmy, emphasizing his strengths as a manager, as a violent thug, as a man who should remain in prison for the safety of the most important person to Henry Hill, himself. Henry, on the other hand, ended up in the witness protection program. Normally, criminals who end up in the program cease to be of any real interest, but not Henry Hill. He just couldn't live a normal life. Along with Henry, his family got into the program. He really wanted his mistress Linda to get in as well, but to Henry's dismay, there was no such opportunity. In good conscience, Linda was quite defensible. Unable to reach Henry directly, the mob tried to reach him through Linda. They tried to bribe her to give Henry up and lure him out. Linda's phone was tapped, and she was being followed by Mafia private investigators. The Mafia had people everywhere. At the phone company, at the banks that issued credit cards, wherever Henry might show up, they had watchers. But federal security was stronger. The mob even reached out to Henry's brother in California and offered him $2 million for Henry Hill's life. But that didn't work either. Henry feared for the lives of his loved ones and spoke directly to his new friends at the FBI about it, and they listened to him. The FBI went directly to those Mafia soldiers who were in the business of threatening Hill's family and friends. They first informed him that you can't threaten American citizens who cooperate with the law, and then showed their teeth by warning that the Mafia had already organized a sweep of their fighters, and the state could repeat that sweep on them. Of course, this would never be officially recognized, but something tells me that Henry Hill's staying alive is a good confirmation that the FBI did have mechanisms in place to keep their witnesses breathing. Anyway, by putting Jimmy Burke away, Henry Hill started a new life, and he came to be known as Peter Haynes. Henry, his wife, and 2 kids, as well as an accompanying marshal named Al McNeil, left New York and traveled to Connecticut to mold Henry a new identity and protect him from old enemies. But before moving on to Henry Hill's new life, it's worth paying attention to another incident in his criminal career, which occurred between the airport robbery and his defection to the authorities. Henry and company robbed the home of Estee Lauder, the creator of the eponymous premium cosmetics company. The 70s were a time when millionaires' vast sums of money were often kept at home in their own safes. Naturally, they were the object of raids by local criminals. The gangsters made serious preparations for this operation, calculating Estee's schedule, finding out how she moved through her schedule, who drove her, and how everything happened. The robbery itself was very simple. At the moment Estee and her security were absent from the house, the gangsters broke in without using force, opened the safes, and stole cash and a huge amount of jewelry. However, the mafiosi could not really use the whole sum. The thing is that the stones had to be properly removed from the jewelry, and the jeweler who did it damaged a lot of the stones because he was being pressured at the time by one of the gang members, who threatened him while using lots of cocaine. Later, this jewelry with precious stones stolen from Estee Lauder ended up with a large number of mobsters, their friends, and mistresses. So much was stolen that Henry Hill, though he gave away diamonds left and right, returned whole bags of them when he went into the witness protection program. His road in the program began in Omaha, Nebraska. This new life disappointed the whole family as the wife missed the elite clubs and casinos, and the children were also uprooted from their familiar surroundings, but their overall survival was easier. Henry was the worst off. He was constantly flying to New York to testify, and when home, he was forced to live the life of an ordinary man. After years of universal reverence, respect, and wealth, it was hard to become an ordinary man. Henry would never become one, although he tried. The witness protection program allowed him to get a job that suited him and paid him a smaller amount of money for the first time, enough to buy a house and a car. His main job during trial was to communicate with law enforcement. The interrogations were constant, and Henry went home only on weekends. However, communication with prosecutors was not only at the table under the light of a dim lamp. They went to different interesting locations, went fishing in different states across America. During this time, Henry traveled more than during his life of crime, and at this time, the rest of the Hills family was locked in their apartment. In some things, Henry did not change. He continued to be an active drug user. At the time, cannabis was growing everywhere in the area he lived, and Henry began to take long walks smoking pot, but the neighbors thought he was working out. Henry also took drugs with him when he traveled to New York for regular interrogations. The family accepted their reality better than Henry did. As they settled in and made friends, the children had hobbies. Henry's son even won a local tennis tournament, but in 1981, they got a call with some news. In a couple of hours, they had to be ready to move. The reason was that law officials had heard word from Jimmy Burke saying it's come to light that creep Hill is somewhere in the Midwest. I mean, Jimmy used far less censored words. Even this slight possibility of Henry being found was enough to change his residence dramatically. Henry was critical to Burke's trial. His death would break the whole case. At the same time, Henry himself sincerely believed that Jimmy had informants even in the Witness Protection Service. Such rumors were actively spread, most likely by Jimmy Burke himself, because fear is the main weapon of the Mafia. Our protagonist's next stop was in Lexington, Kentucky. It was a funny place for Henry Hill because there was a very large federal prison there, where many wise guys moved against their own free will, and their families moved with them, of their own will. Henry made a big fuss about it, contacted the top dog of the Witness Protection Program, and succeeded in moving to another region, where he was offered a house right across the street from a local racetrack, a hotspot for criminals of all stripes, and for bookmakers, a profession Henry himself had made a considerable amount of his fortune with. Even the Witness Protection Service sometimes made incredibly short-sighted actions. Here on his first day, Henry found himself another mistress. Her name was Rose. She was a beautiful 25-year-old blonde, and held the position of secretary to a big local politician. Naturally, her presence did not please Henry's wife, Karen. Even though she was well aware of his other girlfriend, Linda, Rose ended up being involved in the drug trade, and Henry told her who he really was, in flagrant violation of witness protection policies. Henry had an extremely strained relationship with the local marshal because he didn't like the way his words about his dangerous past life were received. As a result, while the marshal drove him to the airport, which was about 90 miles one way, Henry was smoking marijuana, and at the airport, he was constantly drinking in a bar, but the marshal accompanying him was not allowed to drink alcohol. When he made remarks to Hill, Henry responded by simply sending him away, actively using insults. After another change of residence, Henry became Martin Todd Lewis and moved to Kentucky with his entire family. Hill was still quite wealthy. He had his own $100,000, which he possessed officially at the time he entered the program, so he could easily afford to buy the children horses. Everyone in their new location owned horses. It was a popular regional hobby. Surprisingly, Henry got lucky with his kids. They never followed in his footsteps, and they were generally distant from their father. It was his wife and her family who did the child rearing. It was in Kentucky that Henry started cooking, probably the only perfectly legitimate business he not only could pursue but wanted to. True, he worried that obesity would do him in, much faster than Jimmy Burke's boys. Having found himself another mistress, Henry was able to get into the closed club of local jockeys. It would have been very strange if Henry Hill did not start betting, since he lived directly next to a racetrack. He actively began to use both his skills and his new friends to make money from betting. Henry was very good at the trifecta, a type of betting where you have to guess not only the winner but also the second and third place in the race. The money would only be paid out if all three bets fell through. Henry won over $5,000 before his marshals banned him from playing. Then there was a whole series of bans and permits. Apparently, the marshals couldn't make up their minds whether Henry was breaking the law or not. That's also where Henry started his official horse-drawn carriage business. The business failed because Vance, the guy Henry started working with, was an absolute moron, and he also screwed Henry over. And it was Henry's new girlfriend, who he couldn't turn down, that brought them together. Hill invested $75,000 in the business. True, he achieved something. With Rosa's support, he was close to the local authorities. Under Henry's leadership, they made a large horse-drawn trolley service, a carriage that took tourists to local attractions and stores. Henry created a local guided tour that was, on the whole, very much in vogue. The problem was that in order to grow and scale his work, he needed to actively show his face, but Henry was physically unable to do so, as it could quite literally be his own downfall. It got to the point that Henry once ran away from a photographer who wanted to get his picture in the local paper. As a result, 38-year-old Henry was having definite problems not being able to earn a decent income. It's hard enough to be a regular, albeit fairly well-off person after you've given away hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of diamonds for nothing. His lawyer, Robert Simmels, was constantly looking for opportunities for Henry to make money through the media. For starters, in 1981, it was through Robert that Henry signed a contract with Sports Illustrated magazine, and later Robert sought Simon & Schuster Publishing House to publish the book Wiseguy that made Henry famous. The first conversation with a newspaper representative about sports match fixing took place directly in the DA's office. The contract with Sports Illustrated would be the first really profitable work from Henry Hill, as he received $10,000 per article. Moreover, Henry would not have to do anything special. The magazine would have almost all the necessary information already, and Hill just added some important notes. Of course, the representatives of the Witness Protection Program knew nothing about the interview or the book. The book was written by Nicholas Pileggi, who was already a well-known crime journalist and worked for New York Magazine. Henry knew his writings, and they had a lot of phone calls and sometimes met, which, again, goes completely against the basics of witness protection. Curiously, Henry chose Nick himself, and he had a choice of 3 high-profile writers. It was Henry who came up with the title of the book Wiseguy, which would have been the name of the movie Goodfellas, but Wiseguy had already been used in movies, and so they decided not to repeat it. When law enforcement became aware of contacts between Nick and Henry, it caused a serious negative reaction. However, a direct ban on communication did not follow. But the article in Sports Illustrated completely destroyed the new personality of Henry Hill. He was de-anointed. Besides, he almost did himself the worst favor of his life. The whole case against Jimmy Burke was built on his testimony alone. He was not just the chief witness, but the only witness. Whether or not Henry Hill would be honest depended on the outcome for the case against one of the most violent gangsters of the time, who, by the way, frantically dreamed of killing Hill. Henry had spoken under oath, and the dates and some of the facts in the article for Sports Illustrated differed from his testimony. The problem was that Burke was on trial for, among other things, college game scams. Henry could not afford to lie. In the end, Hill was able to prove that the incorrect dates in the article were unintentional and due to a simple lack of time. He only gave approximate dates and did not testify under oath, as he had done in the courtroom. The trial was atmospheric, a word that best captures such a situation. The room was split in half, with representatives of the law sitting on one side and representatives of crime families with their members on the other. Henry Hill knew all of them, was close, and warm friends with many of them, and now he was the only one ruining their boss, friend, and caretaker with his words. Before the trial, Henry was visited only by his younger brother and his faithful beloved Linda. All the others Henry forbade to come, fearing for their lives. Thanks to Henry's testimony, Jimmy Burke received 12 years in prison for gambling fraud at Boston College, and then received another 20 years for the murder of Richard Eaton. Burke spent the rest of his life in prison from 1982 until 1996, when he died of cancer. In all, with Henry's help, more than 50 people went to prison for serious terms, some of which Henry sincerely regretted. Hill also put away a man he sincerely appreciated and respected, Paul Vario. In 1984, Paul received 4 years in prison for organizing a no-show job for Henry Hill, i.e. a job where a person is officially listed, receives money, but may not even show up. A year later, once again with Henry Hill's direct assistance, Paul Vario was indicted, this time on a whole bunch of charges, including racketeering and extortion, and received another 10 years behind bars. In 1988, Paul Vario died in prison of lung cancer. However, we've strayed too far into the future. Throughout his time, Henry Hill continued to engage in occasional criminal activity. He forged checks, for which he was prosecuted, though not as Henry Hill, but as Marty Lewis, another name he used for quite some time, and he became addicted to hard drugs again. Little by little, Henry was going crazy with the situation he found himself in. He reconnected with his family, calling them from home, knowing full well how easy it was for the Mafia to obtain any phone records. At that point, Henry had only been in the witness protection program for a year and a half. The trials were in full swing, and he was being tolerated. In 1982, Henry Hill, after another violation of the rules, flew out of the witness protection program, but not completely. He continued to receive protection, but now by the FBI as opposed to just the marshals. The feds had developed their own special protection program, so for Henry, nothing changed much. He was still protected and still got paid. Once under the protection of the FBI, Henry and his family moved again. The next destination was Seattle. This was the third major relocation under the program, and naturally, Henry started talking about who he was again. And naturally, he got a new girlfriend, Sherry. Henry very quickly found himself a decent group of friends among 3 brothers, a dentist, a nuclear physicist, and a carpenter, all 4 of whom were perfectly united in alcoholism. Henry was a damn lucky man. He told the 3 drunks everything about himself, and no one ratted him out to the mob. At this point, Henry continued to communicate with Nick Pileggi, as they were writing a book together. He continued to travel to the courts, where he actively interacted with Linda. In Seattle, Henry got the idea to marry Sherry, not as Henry Hill, but as Marty Lewis, who, unlike Hill, was not married yet. Why he did it is an interesting question. Henry himself called it a great alcoholic frenzy. When Henry Hill reported it to Nick Pileggi, he thought he was crazy. Perhaps he was, for Henry did try to live with Sherry, only to soon have her throw out all of her belongings and send them back to his wife, who amazingly accepted her wonderful husband back. The bigamy, which would come to light a little later, would be one of the arguments for Hill's and his official wife's full exclusion from the witness protection program. At the time of his love affairs, Henry was fairly wealthy. He and Nick Pileggi were receiving $15,000 a month in advances alone, out of a total advance of $175,000. Henry also received money from his brother Joe, who was also involved in criminal activity and later arrested for tax evasion, and from an acquaintance of a smuggler who sold drugs. One time, Henry covered for him and even saved his life. Perhaps the smuggler paid him for this, and perhaps it was for the drug trade, which Hill conducted for him secretly. Again, Henry does not disclose the facts here. It was at this time that his wife Karen first started earning money. She had been trained in a number of trades and was keen to open her own beauty parlor. What's more, Karen looked after a respected local senior, receiving $2,000 a month. The old man, named Middleton, had a considerable fortune, and when he settled on the ranch that Hill bought for his family, he often talked to Henry. Hill was constantly amazed at how much money this practically century-old man, who made no attempt at all to save money, had managed to save. All the money that Hill himself had earned, he had aimlessly squandered throughout his life. Henry was his private cook, which he wasn't upset about at all. He was more upset that he was now cooking for the type of people he used to take millions from. Not because of any aggression toward the particular old man, but simply because of this injustice of fate. And then there was a small company near the ranch called Microsoft. In 2004, Henry sincerely regretted that he lost his ranch, because it, in the truest sense, would have become golden. In 1985, Henry Hill found another woman of his heart, Kelly Norblatt. She took care of horses at Hill's house, was friends with Karen, and was just a nice person whose husband was a small-time drug dealer that Henry sometimes bought from. Their relationship was progressing steadily enough, but there was no way it was going to reach a natural conclusion until Kelly's husband had his jaw broken. This had nothing to do with Hill. On the contrary, he helped him to get to the hospital, and later Kelly continued to work with Henry's family, but only until the Wise Guy book was published. After that, Henry helped Karen open her salon, and that was the first time he seriously ended his relationship with her, leaving her for Kelly. However, he was still many years away from divorcing Karen and marrying Kelly. In the same year, Henry traveled to Italy for the first time. He was actually a witness there as well. For many years, pure heroin in New York came from Italy, and it was Jimmy Burke who sent Henry Hill to communicate with Italian mobsters directly at the time, while he slowly and methodically killed all those who were associated with the Lufthansa robbery. Henry had organized the supply of the drug and passed it on to dealers in Harlem and other hotspots, who made 25 street doses from one clean dose. In 1985, Henry was the first witness to travel from the United States to Italy to testify. The trip was prepared for almost 6 months. Specialists from Interpol, the FBI, and local Italian agencies participated in transportation and preserving Henry's safety. He stayed in the best hotel in Milan and visited the best restaurants, which, for safety, were completely free of visitors. Hill then testified against Michele Sindona, a banker for the Sicilian Mafia, and it was Henry's testimony, if Henry himself is to be believed, that proved decisive. After that, the number of trials began to dwindle, and Henry was able to live a simple life with his new sweetheart, Kelly. There was one problem, though. Henry had no money. At that time, the book Wise Guy was a bestseller and was extremely popular, but Henry received only the royalties and nothing else. It was 1987. All his income was $1,500 from the US government, which also needed him because he was now a part of it. Henry could not receive income from the book, the fault of the so-called Son of Sam law, according to which a criminal could not receive money for publishing information about his crimes. And payments from an acquaintance and his brother stopped for reasons Henry never named. Henry and Kelly, having no money, lived in all sorts of backwoods, pretended to be hippies, and were probably even happy. It was that year that Henry was contacted by Martin Scorsese and began consulting for the production of Goodfellas. Henry stopped using coke, although the two generally led a far from sober lifestyle. Afterward, Henry decided to return to Karen and finally set things straight. But it didn't quite work out that way. Problems began at home, including drug-related ones. A pregnant Kelly flew in, and Karen and Henry convinced her to get rid of the baby. They did more drugs, and Kelly was being treated for breast cancer. During her treatment, everyone lived together: Henry, Karen, and Kelly. At the same time, there was also an active drug trade going on in his house. Even all the people involved were noting the degeneracy and absurdity of what was going on. It could not end well. Sure enough, Henry was caught selling dope as part of a controlled buy by DEA agents. Henry's notoriety played against him, as the local authorities were sure that they were arresting a major drug lord and not some small-time addict with a big name, which at the time was Henry Hill. Henry was apprehended and sent to a prison on Terminal Island in Los Angeles, where the Gambino family ruled. Only a miracle allowed Henry to survive 2 assassination attempts until his friends were able to secure separate terms for the fallen gangster. The word fallen best describes the situation he was in. At this point, Henry was finally ineligible for support under the Witness Protection Program, even in the skewed way that he had been for the past few years. Hill was eventually sentenced to 10 years of probation and a year of closed drug treatment, and for 5 years he was required to submit to drug tests every week. In 1989, Sharon came back into both Henry and Kelly's lives. The same one who had been Henry Hill's wife under a different last name. Despite the fact that bigamy is a serious crime, Henry went unpunished because he was protected by the law at the time. The rest of Sharon's monetary claims were broken up by Karen. Henry Hill's story is at times remarkably similar to a very bad, sleazy romance novel, only it happened for real. Indeed, his ex-wife was in court with his former illegitimate wife, disputing her argument that Sharon had been deceived. After all, Sharon was not deceived and knew exactly who she was marrying. Perhaps Karen was also influenced by the fact that half of Henry's property belonged to her as his wife. The fact that Henry had been living with another woman had no effect on the situation. After 1989, Kelly and Henry were living back together. Kelly was pregnant again, and everything was mostly fine. As a complete surprise, Goodfellas got the green light, and Scorsese paid Henry $480,000 for his work on the movie, paying this money as one private person to another, because Hill had many restrictions. On top of that, Henry was supposed to receive 15% of the net profits from the movie, but he received nothing. Legally, the movie just couldn't pull it. In the movie, Robert De Niro's character was supposed to be named Jimmy Burke, but Burke's daughter decided to file a lawsuit, causing the name to be changed during filming. De Niro and Scorsese often called Henry, clarifying many subtleties, because Robert wanted to play the perfect gentleman, Jimmy Burke, even if his name was not the same. Henry loved the movie very much. The only thing he said was that Joe Pesci played a very soft, incompetent version of DeSimone, as odd as that may sound. As for Ray Liotta, Henry did not communicate with him intentionally, so as not to interfere with his portrayal of the wise guy Henry Hill. That same year, the movie My Blue Heaven came out, created by Nikki Pileggi's wife, Nora Ephron. In this film, Henry saw many exact allusions to his own life in the witness protection program. He was acquainted with Nora and interacted with her often. The similarities are especially noticeable when the main character in the film suddenly became a bigamist while in the witness protection program. And a year later, Henry, and a huge swath of lawyers, won a lawsuit against the Son of Sam law, and Henry got his payments for the book Wise Guy. And so publishers and Hollywood were able to pay any criminal for stories about their crimes. Over $500,000 perfectly legal dollars came to Henry in a year, the vast majority of which Henry gave away, because for a long time he was simply living on borrowed time. It's ironic that Henry paid more than $100,000 for drug treatment, but still continued to use drugs, which were an important part of his expenses. In 1990, Henry moved to Los Angeles and became actively engaged in various parts of the movie industry, completely legally. And everything would have been fine if not for his drug problems. In 1999, Henry lived in a recovery home, a private community for recovering alcoholics and drug addicts mixed with the Jewish community. He lived there for 2 years, calling them the first 2 years of being clean and sober. Henry Hill's story is like a very bad fairy tale written by a terrible writer who could not decide exactly what he was writing. A detective story, a drama, crime thriller, pulp fiction? Surprisingly, this charade ended with an almost classic happy ending. Henry divorced his wife Karen in 2002, the same year that he wed Kelly, who had been waiting 17 years. A year later, he married off his daughter. Her wedding was somewhat overshadowed by the position of his ex-wife's relatives. They earned incredible fortunes from his criminal activities, but did not even present a beautiful wedding ring with diamonds, and Henry recalled how he had given them bags of stolen stones. His dearly beloved Linda died of cancer in 2003. Surprisingly, Henry maintained a good relationship with Paul Vario's grandkids. Even if there was no intimacy, only Jimmy Burke's daughter gave him some apprehension. Toward the end of his life, Henry began to paint and sold his paintings, including online. Both Henry and Kelly made every effort to quit drinking, but were not too successful. Henry never fully coped with his drug addiction. One dose of a measly strong painkiller brought him to the hospital in a coma, and Hill survived simply because he was synonymous with the word luck. He and Kelly would divorce in 2004, and further information about her is lost. It's fragmentarily mentioned that she got married, but no details are available. After Kelly, Henry was in a relationship with Lisa Caserta, an actress and businesswoman who, for good measure, was more than 10 years younger than Henry. They lived together from 2005 until the end of Henry's life. Lisa is now 65 and is involved in mafia history. His first wife, Karen, is still alive. She's 78, living under a different last name, obtained through the Witness Protection Program. His children wrote a book in 2004 called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood. Their perspective on events is quite interesting and far from the way Hill tried to convey his role in the family relationship. Hill was generally hell-bent on exalting and praising himself. Henry died in 2012 of a heart condition for which he had long been treating, one day after turning 69. He passed away quietly as a regular figure in the American movie industry, with a certain amount of fame and in the presence of his family. This is a rather rare ending for an American gangster. Henry was not a good guy, in the usual sense of the word. A brutal killer, an alcoholic and drug addict, a womanizer, and a criminal who never repented for what he did. He lived right by his own value system and had the incredible courage and audacity not to deny it, even as he began to lead a normal life. Henry was not an angel, but an incredibly, just mythically lucky guy who lived a colorful and interesting life as a big-time scumbag.